In this video lecture, we're going to cover the topic of interest rate. We will discuss what is interest rate, the determinants of market interest rate, the term structure of interest rate, and the macroeconomic factors that influence interest rate. In this video lecture, we're going to cover the topic of interest rate. We will discuss what is interest rate, the determinants of market interest rate, the term structure of interest rate, and the macroeconomic factors that influence interest rate. So what actually is interest rate? Companies require capital, and that capital can be raised in one of the two forms. One is either through debt, and the other is either through equity. Now, each channel that the company uses has a cost associated with it. So interest rate is the cost of money that is relevant to debt capital. It is the price that lenders will receive and the borrowers pay in order to get debt capital. Now, there are four most fundamental factors affecting the cost of money. Number one is rate of return. Then you have time preference for consumption, risk, and inflation. Now over here, risk and return are always connected. So if a project is a high risk project, then automatically the return that the lenders will require will be high for it. So if you're lending your money to someone and you know that that person is a high risk option, then automatically you will say that, okay, I am willing to give you a loan when nobody else is, but I will require a higher level of return for that. That would mean I would require a higher level of interest rate for that. Similarly, it happens in the organizations as well. So if a bank is giving a loan to a high risk company and a low risk company, they are going to charge a lower interest rate to the low risk company and a higher interest rate to the high risk company because they need a compensation for taking on the higher risk in the form of higher return. Then the time preference for consumption is also very important over here. For example, if a person is already retired and if a person has just started earning, their preference for consumption is going to be very different. A person who is young, who has just started earning, might have some extra income that they would want to invest in order to save enough amount when they get retired. So they are looking for investment purposes. They are trying to save their money. Whereas a person who has retired, he has already reached a particular age. He no longer wants to save more. He just wants to spend whatever he has earned in his entire life. So for a retired person who is already using his savings, maybe the interest rate will not be a motivation to save even more because he knows he's not going to live that long. But for a person who is young, a high interest rate will be a big factor that, okay, I should save over here more if I want more money by the time I get retired. Then over here you can see another thing is inflation. Now inflation is very important because if there is hyperinflation in a country, then automatically the value of money is going to deteriorate and a higher interest rate will be required in order to make sure that the purchasing power does not get finished off because of that. For example, if the inflation rate in the country is 5% and you have saved at a 3% rate, then the return that you are getting will have a lower purchasing power because the inflation is going to erode it away. So it is always going to be the case that the interest rate should be greater than the inflation rate if you want to increase your purchasing power in the future. And we will see later on that one of the determinants of your interest rate is the inflation itself. Now moving ahead, we're going to look at the determination of the interest rate levels. So the determination of interest rate is simply a supply and demand function. The borrowers are going to bid for the available supply of debt capital using interest rates. And the firms with the most profitable investment opportunities will be willing and able to pay most for the capital. So they will tend to attract it away from inefficient firms and firms whose products are not in demand. Now over here you can see that the supply curve is upward sloping and the demand curve is downward sloping. Over here you have interest rate and over here you have the dollars. So the supply curve in each market is upward sloping because it indicates that investors will be willing to supply more capital given that the interest rates are higher. Likewise, the downward sloping demand curve indicates that borrowers will borrow more if the interest rates are lowered. So you have to remember that the people who are demanding money are going to be the one who want to borrow money. So for them, if the interest rate decreases, if it goes this way, they will be demanding more because it is an expense for them. And people who are the suppliers of money, who are the savers, who have extra cash, those people will be willing to supply more of their money only when the interest rate increases. So if the interest rate increases, they will increase the amount that they are willing to save. So that is a positive relationship. That's why you have an upward sloping curve over here. Now there are two markets over here. One is low risk securities and the other is high risk securities. In the low risk securities, you can see that the equilibrium point is where the demand is equal to the supply, and that is 5%. Whereas in the high risk one over here, S1 is meeting D at 7%. Now, because this is a low risk security, they require a lower level of return. And because this one is a high risk security, they require a higher level of return because they're taking the extra risk over here. Like already discussed, that risk and return have a very important relationship. Now over here, let's assume that the market edge, it becomes relatively even more risky. This changing perception will induce many investors to shift their money from market edge to market L, which is called the flight to quality. Now the supply of funds that have increased in market L, so the supply curve has shifted over here. You can see the impact of this is that the interest rate has decreased because there is a supply of funds, automatically the interest rate in the market has decreased. Whereas as the supply has decreased over here, therefore the market interest rate has increased over here. So it's the same rule that you have studied in economics, that if supply increases, prices tend to fall, and if demand increases, prices tend to increase.